G'day everybody, I'm Patrick. Welcome to the workshop. Today I want to talk about applying texture to timber. I'm talking about changing the actual physical surface of the timber with carving tools, whether they're electrical or hand-powered, and a variety of other techniques as well. I'm not an expert at any of these particular techniques, especially the hand carving. So I'm not going to be describing how to carve a beautiful flower or somebody's name, but I'm going to take you through some different ways that we can cut into the surface of the timber in a decorative way to really increase the value or change the way the timber looks. And I really hope that you can take these techniques and take them further and explore them on your own. So very briefly, before we start, I have a whole bunch of timber blanks here. I've got some hardwood, some oak, a couple of softer timbers, some Oregon here, some really nice close-grained Oregon, and some kauri, which is a really kind of buttery softwood from New Zealand, I believe. It's a little bit harder than Oregon, not as hard as oak. I've also got some plywood to mess around with. We have some hand carving chisels. These are a little scallop chisel, ball peen hammer with a rounded end, standard plunge router with a bullnose bit, and a little blowtorch. So let's jump in, start making some marks on some timber, and we'll go from there. So I only have a handful of shapes of these carving chisels. I've just heard them called two cherries or twin cherries. They're a German brand, I believe. They come in little scallops, little sort of half rounds like these in a variety of widths. This is a number 20. I actually don't know what that refers to. It might be the radius, doesn't look like it. You can get V-groove bits, which do a finer point. You can get really nice shallow carving chisels like this. You can get straight bladed ones. There is a wide range depending on what you're after. And the other carving tool I have is actually a spoon carving hook knife, which I'll just show because you can do wider scallops. So you've got to think about these things like a chisel. They do a really clean cut or cleaner, actually across the grain. It's a little counterintuitive. The reason for that is when you're going with the grain, it's all very well going in. It's very, very smooth. But when you're trying to scallop out of that hole, you're tearing fibers and the chisel actually gets stuck under the grain and can tear it out. It's very smooth going in, really rough going out. So there might be some pattern that you could do where that would work. But in general, I find that working across the grain just gives you a slightly more controlled divot. Now, softwood is really hard because there's not a lot of support in between these hard grain lines, so you end up getting a slightly rough result. You can sand these afterwards, so I'll grab some sandpaper and show you, but I want to show you a pattern that I like working on with these types of chisels, and I think I'm going to do it with my kauri here. We're going to start with a line of scallops here. And we want them to be about the same depth, around the same size, so that their edges just touch. Now you'll notice that these are not perfectly consistent because this isn't something I do every day. After you've done one line of however big you want this, we're now going to create divots that sit about halfway up and in between each one of these scallops. So they'll be offset. And you can start to see this teardrop shape forming by the back of the new cuts and the end of the first cuts. These are getting much more irregular as I go along. I'd need to do a bit more practice and to get that kind of consistency. But I just think that looks so pretty on the right timber. Again, this is kauri. It's kind of like a medium softwood, not as soft as most pines. Great for carving. There's plenty of others. Just look up good hand carving timbers. Keeping in mind that this is time consuming. You don't want to do an entire dining table, for instance. Not only would that be impractical and difficult to clean, it would just take you forever. Maybe that's exactly what you want to do with your weekends. I'm going to show you a similar thing with a spoon carving gouge. This is not traditionally used in this way, but it will give me a much wider raindrop, and you can see, some other patterns. This is my hook knife or my spoon carving gouge. Spoon carving, bowl carving, fantastic little tool, very stabby, but can get you a great result on certain timbers, especially primarily used for greenwood. So much larger divots, similar kind of effect, probably less control with this. So I would say if you want to get really consistent raindrops or teardrop patterns, you're gonna have an easier time using a small knife. What these are designed to do is hog out a lot more material. So the shape of them means you can go quite deep into the timber, but this is not a particularly ergonomic way of using it. So, interesting experiment, probably not the best tool to create this pattern. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is 3 different ways of creating a perfectly round little divot in timber. We have 1 manual way and 2 machine or powered ways. First, whacking it with a ball peen hammer. This is surprisingly effective, as you can imagine, on different timbers. The idea is to make a little divot. You don't want to go so deep that you're actually tearing the fibers, but you can make a fairly consistent little round dent in the timber, which can look pretty. This is an Arbortech ball gouge, and it goes on an angle grinder. So it is a round-headed carving tool, which can be used to do a little consistent round divot or any kind of power carving. A super useful and versatile tool. And the third technique is using a bullnose router bit in a plunge router to create very consistent little divots. Let's whack some stuff with a hammer. So different timbers will respond to this differently. Softwood, obviously much deeper dents. So the Carry and the Oregon, big holes. Hardwood, like American oak or something even harder, will be a much smaller hole. One interesting side effect of whacking timber with a hammer, a rounded point like that, is it actually makes it kind of shiny, so it's quite pleasing. As for creating a hand-hammered finish like you might see in copper, that's just a matter of practice and applying a lot of hammer blows. You need to apply more force with the harder timber, but I'll do a few whacks, see how it looks. So it's quite an interesting dimpled effect. There's no tear out, they're all really smooth. I think the challenging thing with this technique is making it consistent. Obviously there are some parts where I've hit it more times and some parts where I haven't actually hit the timber at all. So getting to a point where you'd covered a board really consistently could be challenging. The Carry responds pretty well to this. And I think with some practice you could create a pleasing little panel, and it's certainly faster than hand carving it. So I've tried to go through and backfill any areas where the hammer had not touched the timber, and I've been able to create a pretty pleasing hand hammered finish. There is some tearing or a little bit of kind of damaging of the fibers, which I think you'd like to avoid. This can be sanded and it can be stained, which we'll do in a sec. I'm not going to do the Oregon because it's going to be much the same, but I'm going to show you a similar thing on American oak. So much harder, so the divots are smaller. Looks less impressive on here because they're not as deep, but let's go ahead and apply a little bit of stain and see what it looks like. I've got just some spirit stain, black alcohol stain. Gloves, I don't want my hands to be jet black today. Got a bit of sandpaper, a little rag. There's so many different things you can do with texture and color, and I'm just touching the surface. When you're doing little pigment tests or little finish tests, there's a temptation to grab a huge rag and dip the whole thing in the pigment and then rub that over the timber. But the larger your rag, the more pigment is being absorbed. So I like to get a little tiny scrap, fold it into a little pad and work with that. So you can see if you're applying it lightly, then you don't get down into the divots, which is an interesting effect. It's not what I'm going for here, but there is a world in which you could apply that really lightly with a roller. My intention right now is to fully stain into the divots. I mean, for one thing, that just looks awesome, but what I want to show you is what happens when I sand it off. I'll do the American oak as well. Just rubbing off any excess here. It's soaked in much differently to the Carry than the oak. You can see a lot more of the oak grain than the Carry. What I want to show you is what happens when you sand this. So I think these looked better before they were sanded, but I'll show you anyway. Because I did this right after the stain was applied, I don't think I got a very clean result because some of that wet stain was just kind of being moved around by the sandpaper. But you can see how it really highlights the different areas of relief. So the low parts have the stain, the high parts do not. You can also see some areas where the stain has kind of crept into some torn out timber, so it's not super clean. But if you fully let this dry, I think it can work really well. Interesting thing with American oak is the grain is so deep that the stain is staying down in there as well as in the divots that were created by the hammer. That's all I'm going to show you with the hammer. You could use different shaped hammers. You could use a flat face hammer to get a different result. I think there are probably better ways to achieve this particular texture. So let's move on to the power tools. Okay, so the ball gouge goes on an angle grinder. I generally just take the guard off because it's not really offering any safety as the ball sits away from the body. Even though this is a powered tool, it's still essentially hand controlled. You're deciding where those divots are gonna go. You can use this so that it is cutting with the grain as it spins or across the grain, and it's worth experimenting with that to see which result you like best. I'll throw some Oregon in here and we can put a battery on this and give it a shot. You need ears and eyes, potentially a face mask when doing this, especially if you're doing a lot of carving where you're throwing a lot of chips. I'm just gonna do some little divots. I'm happy with just the eyes and ears today. So I was doing those cuts in the direction of the timber. This little ball is spinning around, which means that as it's scooping the timber out in that grain direction. And you can see on the back side of each of those little holes, there's a little tear out. Quite clean going in, a little tear out on the back. So now I'm going to try turning this 90 degrees. So instead of the ball gouge going with the grain, we're actually going perpendicular to the grain like that. And we're going to see how that affects the cleanliness of the cut. Okay, still have a little bit of tear out, but it's not so bad. And I'm gonna change from the Oregon now to some American oak and to see if that changes the finish that I'm getting. Okay, and the American oak, it is much cleaner in both directions. I'm able to work with the grain without any tear out, as well as across the grain. With the grain actually worked better, smoother in this instance. Okay, so I've done a couple tests on the American oak. I'm going to show you how you can create lines with this, create a deeper little bowl, as well as kind of a dot pattern. We're able to create some lines, a nice deep bowl there. You might have seen as I was trying to carve that, you really do need to be aware of grain direction. As you get deep into that bowl, if the ball gouge is turning this way, it will tear the fibers out on the upside. Same as if you were using a chisel in that direction, you'd get fiber tearing out. I also did sort of more of a raindrop, sort of hand hammered finished like I was doing with some of the others just to compare. You can get a beautiful effect. You still need to be aware of tear out in order to get it really smooth. But when you overlap those little circles, you get kind of a more geometric pattern. I think over a large area that could be really effective. And you can actually sand this afterwards. The sanding is only somewhat effective. It's very difficult to get sandpaper down into each of those divots, and the more sanding you do, the more you lose the definition of the sharper areas. So you need to be aware that whatever finish you're getting straight off the blade is more or less what you're going to achieve. You could go through with something like a wire brush or some other kind of softer sanding implement, which might help, but it's best to try and get the best results you can from the tool before trying to sand a texture like this, because you end up just losing definition. Okay, so the next tool we're going to show is a plunge router with a bullnose bit. So a good way to set this up is figure out what depth you want that divot to be and set a depth stop accordingly. That gives you a really high degree of consistency, because unlike with the other tools we've used so far, you can only go to the depth that is set. You could use a plunge router like this to try and create a very consistent pattern where you'd drawn a grid and you tried to come down on those grid points. I think inherently that would be really difficult unless you created a jig that gave you a really high degree of accuracy. So instead what we're going to create is essentially a random pattern, as we have been with everything else so far, or potentially more like the raindrop pattern that was a bit handmade, but a bit, ultimately organic. So we're getting a little bit of burning. I think I can reduce the depth. This goes down almost 2.5 or 3 mil. I'd like that to go down about 1 mil. So I'm gonna reduce the depth stop that I've set, and I'm gonna be hitting the timber a little slower to reduce burning. Because of the shape of the bit, as we reduce the bit's depth that is penetrating the timber, we're also reducing the size of the dots. So if you really want a broad but shallow dot, you need to choose a really large bullnose bit. I think it's a 19 mil bullnose bit, so if I make it 1 mil deep, it's gonna be quite a small dot. I feel like that still could be a little shallower. I'm gonna swap this out for a broader bullnose bit to get closer to the effect that I'm going for. So that was the 19 mil bit that was very deep, 19 mil bit less deep, and now this is my 25 mil bit, but very shallow. And you can see I've created something more linear and then something more random. One effect of using a bullnose bit like this is there is a slight indentation in the center of each divot, which is just an artifact of the fact that you're using a centrally spinning bit from above. The very middle of that bit doesn't have a direction of cut because it's the center of the spinning point. And so you naturally end up with a little tiny indentation in the center. But still, very pleasing, consistent depth. I think you could achieve something really nice with this. You could push that a little deeper too. You're not limited to using bullnose bits. You could use a straight bit, which would give you a very round, straight-edged round hole, or a variety of other shapes as well. And you're not limited to using dots. You could do squiggles, you could do lines, you could do something that was a lot more fluid. You can do all kinds of things. You're limited only by your imagination, really. There's one other tool I'll talk about, which is similar to the ball gouge. This is also by Arbortech. It also goes on a grinder. It is the turbo plane, and it is used for carving out larger amounts of timber. So the ball gouge does, in the internal components, any place where you need to get into a hole. This will remove a large amount of material, but it's a much broader shape, so you can't get in as deep. That being said, it is super useful. So one more router pattern that I want to show you is this little fish scale pattern. This is done using a straight bit in a trim router with a small jig that allows the router to slide in and out at an angle, and then you can reference the position of the jig by creating a grid on the plywood. Your grid is essentially needs to be the same size as the router bit. So in this instance, I was using a 19 or 20 mil round router bit, just a straight bit. That allows me to create a series of divots in exactly a grid orientation. More or less, I'm aligning the jig to the grid by eye, so there's some error, but it's consistent enough for this process. You do one line and then you offset it by half the width of the bit and do another line. And that's how you get this interlocking fish scale pattern. This jig was super simple to make, just some scrap timber made so the trim router can slide in and out. I didn't even really check the degrees, I just used a wedge that I had on hand. But you can create jigs to make patterns much more easily if you don't feel like you want to spend a long time cutting something by hand. I mean, this would be near impossible to cut by hand anyway. You'd need a specific chisel for it. I'm sure there is a way you could do it, but it wouldn't be my idea of a great time. So yeah, simple jig, not particularly time consuming to create an interesting pattern on timber. You could design your jig however you want to make a variety of patterns. It's really up to you. So the last texture I would like to show you is using the blowtorch. This is just a little, it's called MAP gas, it's like a little butane torch. This burns the surface layer of the timber. It works especially well on softwood because it can penetrate those soft layers really quickly, more quickly than it can burn the harder layers of grain. You can then go back and remove that charred, crumbly material using a wire brush or some other kind of abrasive material, and it creates these lovely undulations. I'll show you on some sort of crown cut softwood where you can really easily see the big grain definition, as well as some quarter sawn, really tight grain Oregon. And I'll show you a couple different brushing types so you can see the result. All right, let's go burn some stuff. Don't do this somewhere where something else is gonna catch fire, like the forest. I've got a lot of gravel space around me here, so it's safe enough. I'm gonna do one really deep burn and one shallower burn so we can see the difference in texture. And yeah, these couple different cuts on the softwood. Okay, so we've got our burnt pieces of timber, still nice and warm, but not gonna hurt me. We'll start with the soft, slight burn. You can still see some color of the timber coming through, so I haven't charred it right down to that heavily crackled surface. I'm gonna do half with a heavy wire brush, so I'm just scraping with the grain. Because this is softwood, the wire brush is gonna actually be adding texture. The wire will cut into the softwood. It will be removing the char, but it will also be kind of removing some other material. Okay, and then I'm gonna use this much softer wire brush. It is much gentler. You can also use a green scouring pad that works surprisingly well, or a very stiff, like, what would it be called? Like a fiber broom. You can use a very stiff one of those. Okay, I'm gonna do my heavily charred one and then we'll compare the results. And lastly, the crown cut. Okay, let's start with the quarter sawn stuff. So, I have the heavily wire brushed section. It looks quite rough. You can really see the grain is quite pronounced. I can't tell much of a difference between the heavily charred and the less heavily charred, except for the color of the timber. But if we turn it around to the side that was done with a softer wire brush, you can see the grain, but you can't see the scratches created by the wire. It's a much more pleasing result with the softer brush. You're seeing grain definition, you're not seeing a whole bunch of extra abrasion. Now this is a lot more apparent when we move over to this crown cut one. So we've got our wire brushed one here, and then our soft brass brush here. So in here, in the light, you can really see the high-low areas of grain, but you're not seeing a lot of scratching. It looks kind of sandblasted, or maybe like if you found some wind sculpted timber on the beach. What's that called? Driftwood. Looks a bit driftwoody. Whereas this one that's done with a heavy wire brush, you're getting that driftwood look, but you're also getting these deep scratches, which I don't find as pleasing. So I've seen this done in a really interesting way where they've burnt the timber, brushed it, and then they've stained it black again. So it gives the impression of being just freshly burnt, but the surface is totally stable. You're not gonna get any dark sort of ash or anything coming off it because all of that soft stuff has been removed and then it's been re-dyed. This burning, it doesn't work terribly well on anything except for softwoods. I think in Japan it was traditionally done with cedar. I'm using Oregon, that seems to work great. I've done it with American oak. The timber's grain is kind of too close together and it doesn't show a really soft, hard definition like Oregon, or you can do this with general pine. You could use, store-bought studs to make something and burn it if you want. It's worth noting that the wire brush alone will add texture to timber. If that's something you're interested in, this is a piece of just Oregon, very close-grained Oregon. If we distress that with the wire brush, trying to get an area where this catches the light, you can see that it does expose the grain in some way. Sometimes people do this on big pieces of furniture with a wire brush to give it kind of a beachy or weathered look. It really takes stain much more heavily when you open the grain like that, and it gives it a tactile feel. I have not done a full piece in this burning method. The Japanese name for it, I believe, is shosugiban, which I don't know exactly what it means. I should look it up, but it's the practice of burning cedar. It acts partially as a preservative. It blocks some of the UV damage that happens to timber, and it also gives this beautiful blackening effect. I have done some of this on external timber work, and it stays black for almost indefinitely until that black layer sort of slowly weathers away, but it does protect the timber. Okay, so we're at the end of the process. I can figure out what I like and what I don't like. Let's start with the hand carved raindrop. I just always think that looks really cool. It's time consuming, but the result is beautiful, and I would love to have the opportunity to practice this a lot more. The Arbortech ball gouge I find incredibly effective for removing a lot of material, but it's not an incredible finishing tool. That being said, with the right timber, with very low tear out, you could get some interesting results. What I do love with this tool is just the freedom to be able to do deep divots or lines or little puddles, whatever you want, really effectively. I was really chuffed with this fish scale pattern. I want to explore it more. I think it was really clean. Once I set the grid up, it was really effective. The plunge router with the bullnose bit, I think was really effective as well. I don't love the little tiny sort of pinhole in the center of each divot. It looks like a machine mark because it is. That being said, I'm sure there's something you could do with it. The hammered finish on the cowrie is surprisingly effective, and I didn't love it when the stain was applied to this one, but I think it was a really interesting finish. It worked better than I thought it would. So that was kind of my favorite one. And then the burning. Burning works really well. You know, you can really get a lot of definition between the grain. You're not adding a human-made texture to the wood, you're just exposing the texture in the wood itself, which is a really nice effect. So, that is just scratching the surface on the textural stuff that you can do with timber. With better skills, more time, a variety of carving tools, you can create anything you want. There's whole fields of carving that we haven't touched on here. Different ways that you can carve things that are more pictographic, text, drawings, whatever you want. It's not really my field, but maybe one day I'll get into it so I can do a video on it. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you've tried anything to add texture to timber that you've really liked. I did mention that there's a whole lot you can do when you do texture in combination with color. I've got a couple of examples here that I don't have time to go into today, but this is timber where we've exposed the high and low grain and then stained it differentially, different colors. I've done a whole variety of this for a job a while ago, but there's lots of different applications for that. So I hope you got something out of it. There'll be links to all of these products down below. Hit me up with any questions. If you want to deep dive into any one of these, I would love to hear if you have experienced texturing in a different way. And I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot for coming along. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us out. See ya.